this, and what they do is on the National Church's website, they do actually put together this thing of where you can do a little bit of Bible study on the lessons, and you can either do it where, like today, we're just going to do it because for the ones of the lessons we had today with maybe a little reflection, or you can even go, like say if you were going next week, instead of looking at the lessons you're already going to hear, you can even look ahead at the week ahead and kind of do that to think about that. So when you get to that Sunday, you might have some impressions or not. We'll see if it works. I have some Bibles for those who, if you want to, the passage, it's right here on the sheet. But there's some Bibles here, and I got one paraphrase translation that we might just read once, just to get an interesting, different view of the same passage. I'm going to sneak a bite real quick. Don't look. Because I'll make a mess. Okay. One of the things, let me just read this thing here at the very top. The season of Epiphany is when we celebrate the revealing of Christ to the world. We mark the arrival of the one who is the light of the world, a light that brings life, a light that brings hope. This light shines its brightest when we are in community with God and one another. The Office of Global Partnership of the Episcopal Church invites individuals, small groups, congregations, and dioceses to use our weekly, bring that upstairs. Our weekly video series through the Epiphany, season of Epiphany, to draw closer to each other and our Lord. Using an adaptation of the Lectio Divina with the gospel passage for each Sunday, you'll meet and hear from Episcopal missionaries who have served around the world as they read and reflect on Jesus' revelation to us. Missionary service through the Episcopal Church is accomplished through the Young Adult Service Corps for Episcopalians 21 through 30, and Episcopal Volunteers in Mission for those over 30. And you can learn more about it. So it says this, and then this bottom just say his own here. What we can have, and I don't think we have to do it today because I would start it right away, but I do have my laptop so I can do it if we want to, is they have a thing that you can use community but doing missionary work and to get that kind of perspective. Next week, we could try that, and they talk for about 10 to 12 minutes. And that might might be interesting to kind of see what they think. If we don't like it, you skip it, you just do your own. So you can have the freedom with that. So the way this works is you'll notice there's a 1 through 7. And the first thing we do is read today's gospel passage. I would like to invite one of you to read it. And again, this is from the New Revised Standard Version. And I'm just curious, does anyone not know kind of the basis of what the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version is? It's interesting because people often talk about the King James Version. The King James Version, that name came along actually later. It was always originally known because it was the first really real, well, there were some earlier translations of parts of the Bible, but not the whole. This one was the first one of a complete Bible that they tried to use as much scholarship as it was available to them in 1611 of what they had of text and their knowledge of Greek and Hebrew. So what they did is they used this, the text that they used, the Greek and Hebrew, was called the Textus Receptus. So the text received. So that was really what's the basis, the Textus Receptus. And so they took the Textus Receptus, and here, if you want to, you're fine.
Our reaches aren't very.
So yeah, and if somebody wants to read along in a Bible, if you're like me, come from evangelical, we like to flop our Bibles around. So there's one here. So this is the New Revised Standard. Now, again, what it came from is people will often say, well, only the King James Version. If it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me, And I'm like, well, that's your heart, So
That
So-
really talks, because it's all in red.
And actually, the King James Version that you see today is actually not the original, because the English in which it was written, and whenever you see S's, it was F's. And F's are now S's, but a F was used also for the S sound. So people who say they want that are really kind of getting the original, because it's already been worked on.
Not to
So-
mention that most of the copies in the United States have had the, well, I can't remember the part with the Maccabees, everything like that. It's all been taken out.
The Apocrypha, the books, and in here, like on this one, these that I have, it says the Holy Bible with the Apocrypha Deuterocanonical books, which are those ones that's at the end of the Old Testament. They're about 8 or 10 that are extra in there, like in the one that's most well known as Maccabees, and which kind of really talks about what happens where it ends, what we often hear of the next period leading up to Jesus, when there is the revolt against the Greeks, when they defile the temple, and some of these things. And it's actually very messianic. There's a lot of stuff in there that, if you really wanted to relate to Jesus, is more clearly related than some other things we point to. But it was in the original, all original translations. It was only some Protestant scholars that decided it was optional or should be taken out. And there's really no good reason. No, they just, someone, I guess, got a bee in their bonnet. It's just kind of silly. We have them. We don't read from always, but you'll see people occasionally, like one, we do get we have the book of Ecclesiastes. Well, there's also the book of Ecclesiasticus. And that's in the apocryphal books. And we do get readings from that, and sometimes some the reading from Baruch and so forth. And so there's beautiful things in that. Okay, well, what happened is after the King James Version, which was wonderful, and I think a lot of people like it, is they just grew up with it and hearing that rhythm. If you even notice, like yesterday, a good example, in Episcopal Church, no matter what, if you're using the most modern rites, when you do Psalm 23 at a funeral, you do the King James Version of Psalm 23, not the Psalter version, which you do in worship, but you don't at the funeral, because it's the one that people. If you also notice that in the Book of Common Prayer, we have an option of, when we get to the Lord's Prayer, the old kind of Rite One Elizabethan Lord's Prayer, or what they say is the kind of the contemporary version. Now, occasionally we have used both. When we were singing the Lord's Prayer, we were actually doing the contemporary version in the past season, but in Advent. But if you notice, we still do here the Lord's Prayer and Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. We still do that. So there's just comfort in that of things that people. That's really kind of the main thing. It's not really about scholarship. So what happened is there was an early kind of updating of the King James. They went along just a little bit, but they never call it revised. They just kind of just did it. And people got used to it, and people have no idea it was really done. But the major revision came in the started working on it in the late 40s and in the 50s. Biblical scholars, by the 1950s, all of these, the Textus Receptus was what you had in the Greek and the Hebrew, they were things that were a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And they're like, but still, going far back. What we found is there was through archaeology and other things, and like the Dead Sea Scrolls and other stuff, we found the same text, but much, much earlier and closer to the original. So maybe it was just a copy of a copy. So it went back some times hundreds of years closer to the original. And we all know in anything you do, the closer to the original, the more likely you're going to have closer to intent and meaning without people editing. So in the 1950s, the scholars took the King James and said, we need to update it according to the earliest Hebrew text and stuff where there's maybe some grammatical errors or things were odd that they kind of wondered about, but they got clarity. The other thing they said is the English we speak now is not the English of the 1600s. And I'll give you one, good example. Some of you may have heard this. I hope I haven't said this too much, but a good example is there's things that are in the King James that was the vernacular of the day that people clearly understood that doesn't mean anything to us now. There's the part where Jesus and the disciples in one of the Gospels are setting out across the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus says, "Let us fetch a compass." What does that mean?
You need to find direction.
Need to find a compass, and most people say, "Well, he's like, well, this guy." Well, they didn't have compasses first of all back then, so so they're using a word that they understood for what they were already translating there. But for us, but that was a very popular English nautical term in the 1600s that means to turn around and come back to shore, meaning to turn and come back. And he says, what he's saying is, let us return to the shore. So what they did is instead of saying, let us fetch a compass, and everybody's going, what in the heck is Jesus talking about? They put, let us go return to the shore. So that was done in the 50s, and that was called, and by the way, the King James Bible was always known as the Standard Version. That's actually its technical name, not the King. It was the because it was the Standard in English. So what they did is they just updated it in the 50s and then corrected the English to the English we now speak. So it was actually more literal than it was before. So people are going like, well, King James, these are actually more closer than what we've ever had. I mean, we're fortunate in biblical text today. Okay, so that was in the 50s, and then later, so it was called the Revised Standard Version. And it was pretty much the common one. And then later, more texts were found in the sense of the translation part, and it's more accurate. So that's just because sometimes people may come to you and say, oh, well, this is the King James. Oh, you say, well, we actually are using more of the King James than you. It's just a different way. And that's used, this is the actual text that is mostly read for public reading in the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, I think the United Church of Brethren. A lot of the main churches use this. And of course, it's okay. The Episcopal Church says here are approved texts you can use for reading and everything. And of course, privately, you can use whatever you want. I will tell you one, and I know this is, because we're talking about Bible, I'm sorry, but I'm going to give you a little longer intro here, that one that I will tell you I just personally do not recommend, but is very popular, and is the NIV, the New International Version, because it was done specifically only by scholars who had all agreed on certain doctrinal beliefs that you all had to adhere to. And they were mainly evangelical, very conservative. And so what they did is they took the text and put it in I have to admit, there's places where it has a really nice clarity. It's very modern. It's like we talk. But they've translated some words into words that were not the Greek or the Hebrew. There's some things where they use words that are actually words that are made up words from the 1940s and 50s, which didn't exist before then. And I mean, I'll give you one, and I know you think this is just personal, and I'm not trying to be defensive, but just to give you an example. They will say in there, those who will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, and they list, the idolaters, everything, and it says, and homosexuals. First of all, that word was invented in the 1920s in France as a way of describing, because there weren't really words for that. It's a make-up word where you got two words that they combined together, and it just and then was used. And I don't think it's necessarily negative or positive or anything. It's kind of neutral. And we know things we use, wording changes over time. But what the word there in the Greek is not someone who has sexual relations with the same thing. Doesn't say that. It's a Greek word that literally translate into those who lie on soft couches. Well, I think if you want to get literal, that's a lot of people. I do lie on a pretty soft couch in the evening, and I stretch out and like, okay, nobody from church called me right now. But and what that meant was in Jesus' time, there's another. If you look, there's some other passages where, and it talks about those in fine purple robes who lay, and there's that thing about it means those who only care about their own comfort at the expense of others. They do not practice hospitality or take care of the poor. They are rich fat cats who like to just sit around and lounge and have their gold and all their fancy things. And that's what it really means, actually. But they say, oh no, those people, because they're evil. So they actually put that in a translation. And I don't think they thought that it was so negative, but it's just not correct. It's just not biblically honest. It's not honest. So there's some things you have to be careful. And I will tell you, I'm going to do one reading today from this. These are literal translations. And you have there's two types of translations. One that they try to translate literally from the Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. And then there are those who say, I'm paraphrasing what it is to kind of give an interesting context to who we are now. This one is, some of you may have heard it, it's called The Message, and written by Eugene Patterson. He's the translator. Some cases, occasionally I'll read and go like, oh, Eugene, you're being a little bit of a drama queen here. But he kind of writes it almost as if it's modern America in the Deep South. That's what it's intended. So yeah. And there's places where I read this and I'll burst out laughing because I'm like, oh yeah, I got you right here. And there's early on, it used to say, like in the letter to the Romans, he changed it and said a letter to the church in Atlanta. And so Atlanta becomes Rome and all this, and he uses, because it's the big southern city, and there's terminology like that. So we'll read that one too. There's some cases I really love it, and some I'm going like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So there's a kind of little intro to some biblical things in here. So, number one, someone like to read this one from the NRSV. Thank you.
Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? But Jesus answered him, let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased.
Thank you. Now, this is kind of how Lectio Divina works. And I know some of you may be used to, some not, but it's okay. You start by saying which word or short phrase caught your attention or came to mind. And it doesn't matter if you think it's important. What is it somehow when you're reading this, a word, you just it stuck out, it got your attention, or a phrase. And if you feel comfortable, if you could go around and maybe share, and no explanation, just kind of say, what it was. And you can take your time.
Alighting.
I'm sorry?
Alighting.
Alighting.
Proper.
Oh, okay, interesting.
The beloved.
The beloved.
Then he consented.
And he consented.
Fulfill all righteousness.
And for me, I when I did this the other day, the one that came in, for some reason, it just stuck out to me as well, was he consented also. I don't know why, it just kind of, that was, I hadn't noticed it, I think, before. So it's interesting as you listen to each other, when phrases or words catch your attention. I don't know if you listen, you hear a lot of them are words where you kind of go like, oh. Sometimes we didn't kind of catch it or something, and it's a phrase that, and all this is to really get you to start thinking more deeply about some of the sometimes deep intent in these words. Now, what we'll do is we're going to read it now in a paraphrase. Let me turn to it. Matthew. Oh, these pages are so thin. Come on. There we go. Matthew 3. And it's verses 13 through 17. Okay. Oh, I'm in Zechariah. I was just going to say, I read the thing and it said, shh, everybody be quiet. And I was like, what? Okay. All right. Here we go. 13 through 17. Jesus then appeared, arriving at the Jordan River from Galilee. He wanted John to baptize him. John objected. I'm the one who needs to be baptized, not you. But Jesus insisted, do it. It's God's work. Putting things right all these centuries is coming together right now in this baptism. So John did it. The moment Jesus came up out of the baptismal waters, the skies opened up, and he saw God's Spirit, and it looked like a dove, descending and landing on him. And along with the Spirit, a voice said, this is my Son, chosen and marked by my love, the delight of my life. A little different, isn't it? And again, this is not literal, but it's kind of, if you think about how we say, with someone I'm well pleased, and something to say, this is the one I love who delights my life. Kind of interesting. Okay. Now, we're going to do number 4. Where does the passage, so before it was just something that stuck out to you. Where does the passage touch your life today? And it's just basically kind of think about, as you've heard this and heard it in church today, what is something about how it may relate to you in your life today, or affect you, touch you?
I've just been spending a lot of time on the relationship between John and Jesus. You know, that they were as much brothers as any two people. You know, they knew each other from the time they were conceived, and so I think of it as relationships.
Mm-hmm. And it is interesting because they're technically cousins. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of interesting sometimes that what we hear, at least in the scripture, seems to be almost this formality. I mean, you know, where Jesus comes in and like, okay, I'm going to be baptized. No, you're not. You should baptize me. And it's not like, hey, cousin, what's happening? You know, it's none of that. There's no chit chat going on there. You know?
Well, but it sounds like they're disagreeing.
Mm-hmm.
No, you do this. No, you do this.
Yeah, I have to. What stands out to me with that, back and forth between the two of them, it just makes you wonder, did it literally happen, with more or less this conversation, or is this a addendum by a Christian who knows that Christianity has kind of superseded John's movement, mm-hmm. And wants to kind of write it into the first interaction between John and Jesus, that there's this recognition of superiority, despite it being well known that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. Mm-hmm. Which one is it? And I don't know, and it could be either one, and it just kind of makes you wonder what kind of interactions would they have had in their life up to then in order to have this interaction. Mm-hmm. Would it have been that as the text directly indicates that John is viewing Jesus as his spiritual superior from the beginning, is it that John was tired of baptizing other people and wanted to be able to partake in the same ceremony that he was promoting, but nobody would do it for him because he's the leader of the movement. It just makes you wonder, what kinds of interactions would that involve, or was this entirely a post hoc, viewing back of, oh yeah, it must have happened about like that because that's the way we imagine it, and it's interesting to imagine, especially when you take into account the, if you're actually following a spiritual path, there's a certain point where the temptation to pride, kicks in if you're aware that you're doing it. And that to stay on your spiritual path, you have to be able to reject that sense of pride and in what ways would that kind of humility have been expressed in Jesus's life, which I think you can see in other places where Jesus keeps on saying, I'm not the one who's healing you. It's it's your faith. It's God who's healing you. He very much seems to be saying, I'm the conduit for it happening, but it's not me. Which if you were someone who felt like faith healings did happen around you and through you, but you were absolutely certain it had nothing to do with you because you're just a person and trying to find that balance of that humility. You might say things like Jesus was saying and tell people, don't go around talking about this. Everyone's trying to inflate my ego and I'm sick of it. It's not healthy. I'd stop it. So is this another instance of Jesus, being recognized as a spiritual leader and pushing back on it and, trying to find that balance of humility, saying that I don't want people to look at me as, and it's kind of hard to imagine. And if you're Son of God, part of the Trinity, all that, and yet approaching life with a humility that says, don't put me on a pedestal. And that's.
Well, and you're getting to something I'm gonna as a question coming up.
Yeah.
Also, anybody else? I didn't know if y'all were thinking that. Isn't it okay? This, and usually when you do things of biblical reflections or studies, we love to get on, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, where someone's saying and teaching or proclaiming something. It's usually not always around an event, because you're like, well, okay, well, it's an event, but what does that say? It's easier to talk about something that's like a commandment or whatever. But I think this is important because it's easy, we just kind of accept it because we see Jesus now in our understanding, some 2,000 years later, in the lens of what has been the teachings of the church for 2,000 years, the biblical reflections of different gospels with different perspectives, and we've got Jesus in our mind. I mean, we all have our own personal Jesus, okay? I think over my life, I think how he has changed in my understanding of how I see Jesus. When I was a young person, when I was 12 or 13, it was kind of a different view. Not as probably embracing as the humanity of Jesus. It was more like, ooh, don't touch, But this is actually, in a sense, some people have said what we just read today is scandalous. And here's why. Why, if Jesus is the Savior, the Messiah, if he's the Christ, why is he receiving the baptism of John, which was recognized as a baptism for the forgiveness of sin? So does it surprise you that Jesus did this?
No.
Okay. And I think in our view today it doesn't. But think about back then even. I mean, and even John's going, this is the one whom I'm not worthy in the other Gospels to even untie the thong of his sandals. He is greater than, he clearly sees him as the one. And we know even later on, the disciples of John the Baptist go to go to Jesus and say, "Are you the one? Or is there another one coming? Because we think it's you." And Jesus' response is, "Tell him what you see. You'll know." And he basically then reflects on what Isaiah, we read today, saying, "He will proclaim and good news to the poor, light bring to the world." Now, Jesus, though, if we really understand him as incarnate, meaning, he's fully God but fully human, Jesus here embraces his own humanity. And again, this is one of the marks of Jesus, his humility. And I think that's something, as you read this, to reflect. Jesus says, "Let it be so. Let this be done." In other words, when these people come to John, they're coming saying, "You know what? I'm broken. I've made mistakes in my life. I've sinned. I haven't always followed the way that God calls me." And he says, "Come and do this." And as a symbol of you saying, "I want that restoration, do this baptism and begin this new journey." And here Jesus comes and says, "I'm going to embrace your brokenness." Really, that's kind of what we're hearing. And he goes into the water. But then, and in the end, it's interesting, Jesus never baptized anyone. As far as we know. It's kind of interesting. He got baptized just like we do, but he never then presided over baptisms. And here's a thing I'll reflect to you I think about this is, he submits as we do and embraces humility. He's also the one, and I said, he didn't do baptisms. And as you could probably tell from what I said today, I believe baptism is very important. And this is not just something we do. It's supposed to be life-changing, okay? And sometimes it doesn't all happen at once. A lot of people think, well, I'm going to get baptized, and when I come, after there'll be something, thunder and clouds and lightning. But what happens is life is still very much the same, except it's what you've decided about how you're going to live into it now. And so it's interesting, though, it is important, but it's not meant as a barrier. Because just think about this, and this goes with a lot of discussion around Holy Communion in the church, and it is a sacrament, it is holy, and it is special, and I believe that wholeheartedly. But remember, Jesus is on the cross. There's a thief next to him who's already admitted his guilt and said, "We're getting what we deserve." But he turns to Jesus, with Jesus dying, miserable, in pain, and he says, "Will you remember me?" And Jesus didn't go, "Well, did you get baptized yet? You also need confirmation. Make sure the bishop's laid hands on you." And I'm not making light of that, really. But Jesus says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." Wow. People ask, Jesus responds. And so, like here in this baptism, it's a lot, if you think about the deepness of this, I think that like when it comes to communion, for instance, and the way I kind of see it is, yes, it's a very holy sacrament. It's an outward sign of God's grace. But it's not also meant as a prize or a reward for good behavior or whatever you want to call it. It's meant as Jesus would say, "Well, today you'll be with me in paradise." We say, whoever comes. Now, there is a pastoral duty, I think, for me and clergy, and also the laity should be, is to say someone's new who comes to the church. They've not been baptized, or they don't really know what it's like to be a part of the body. You don't keep it from that. I know some people said, they've said, "Is it okay? I really feel there's something here and I want to take communion." And if someone's searching and they feel that, who am I to say no? What we do later is then we teach. And we say, well, this is what all this means. So again, I'm kind of getting off of the baptism a little bit, but it's kind of related about how Jesus submits as we do, but always welcomes. That's my take on that a little bit. They say read it again, but and sometimes like the Divino, if you get into this, and especially if it's a group and you get used to it, it starts to flow a lot easier. And that's usually done. It's usually done 3 times. And some people go like, well, we've already read it. It's to get each time, as you've heard people maybe share a phrase or something they say that affects my life, or here how does it touch my life, that when you hear it each time, you hear it a little bit different. Okay? Why don't we, before we close, why don't we go ahead and read it just one more time, and we'll kind of read it slowly and just think about it in your heart. Somebody mind doing it one more time?
I can read it. Do you just read it on this page? Is that what you meant?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? Jesus answered him, Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Then he consented, and when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased.
Thanks be to God. So, any kind of just other last thoughts hearing it again?
For me anyway, I think it's just amazing how Jesus, God in flesh,
Mm-hmm.
just brought himself to a place of a complete humility to be baptized, to embrace his full humanity, just as all of his followers, are commanded to do. And I think it just kind of speaks to me.
Yeah.
The part that stands out to me is suddenly the heavens were open to him.
Mm. And the one that, like this time for me, was in this way to fulfill all righteousness. And I got to thinking, like, well, what does that mean? And I think about it in the sense of righteousness means being in right relation. That's actually what righteousness means. It's not about being holier than everybody else. And, ooh, look at me. I wear a dog collar. And I am God's beloved, but not more than you. And to say to fulfill all righteousness, Jesus says, the righteous way is for, you need to hear this, John, is for me to submit and accept what all humanity is called to accept. And I think, like, wow, that's powerful. That's righteousness, is the ability to embrace and love who we are. So that's my thought about that. Okay, well, I'm not going to keep you because it's kind of a long day. And I thank you. Now, I'm just curious. I know this was the first time talking, but what did you kind of think? So I mean, let's put it this way. We can do this for several weeks or in the Epiphany season, and next time I would have the little intro from the speakers. I do find some of the stuff they say is really good. It gets you kind of the juices going, we can do that. But if this is not kind of something y'all think you might do, we can have other discussions. I just haven't got much feedback about maybe something. And I'm going to start looking at, because Lent, we're going to have several options for people. And you'll be seeing this stuff coming out in the newsletters and stuff for reflection, study, meditation, all this, worship during that time. But for Epiphany, I don't know, any thoughts right now? And if you don't have any, that's okay. But,
I like
Me too.
Yeah,
I like it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I really like it. I do it, so, in contemplative outreach. But what I like about it is it makes me stop and think. In other words, it's like we're reading just a little bit. And instead of like me reading 40 pages or something, it makes me think about that. And to think about not only what does it mean, but how am I going to use it in my daily life?
mm-hmm.
Well, I like hearing what
Yeah.
others have to say. It gives me,
Right, I'm like, oh, you thought that, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we all have our we all have our initial impressions and stuff, and I'm always surprised by that somebody will do something. I'm like, oh wow, that's really insane. I hadn't thought about that. You know, so, and if you want to even look ahead for next week, do y'all know how to look for the lessons for next? I can shoot. I don't have my phone. But I can easily tell you what they are. Or if you go to the Episcopal Church website, there's a thing that will connect you to the lectionary there. But I will tell you, anytime on the web here, it's very easy to remember. Lectionary.org. You go to lectionary.org, and when you go there, it will it'll have Episcopal Shield, and it said it's the Sunday, and it'll show a calendar, and you just click on that date, and it'll show the scripture, but then it actually has all the passages right there that you can read.
Is
So-
it right one or two?
Huh?
Is it right one or two? Do they specify?
Well, no. Well,
Or is that the
in the Bible, there's no right one or two.
No, on the lectionary, the one I've seen in the past, there's a right one. and a
Right two, that's for the actual liturgical, the
Oh,
worship,
okay.
because you can do the worship in the traditional Elizabethan language, or you can do it in our contemporary modern English.
Okay.
Right two is what 98% now of most churches use. But I have to admit, I still occasionally I will confess, I like right one. And for a lot of the sentimental reasons too, because it's just beautiful the way it, but if you go to lectionary.org, the other thing I'll tell you when you go to, did anybody just look at it?
I did, but it took me to the wrong place. To
Uh-oh.
make a sermon writer.
Oh, no. Just try the,
So you'll be given a third.
did you, try the www.lectionary.
Lectionarypage.net.
Maybe, is that it? Did I do the wrong org? That's it, it's net, not org. My apologies.
Lectionarypage.net.
Jeez, I can't.
You're not even
It comes up
close.
on my computer automatically, so I sometimes, I know it's lectionary.
Sure it
So
used to.
lectionarypage.net.
Yeah.
And that, you can look at any Sunday. The one thing interesting, once you go onto that page, if you scroll down, it actually will let you access, you can click all the lesser feast and fast, or like the scriptures for burials, the scriptures for weddings, for everything. It'll say you can now go down there and click on that, and it'll take you to the other page of other lectionaries for specific events. But all the Sunday ones are right there. So if you ever want to look ahead. Okay. Thank you.
Thank
I did
you.
find